for Cutting Edge Consciousness with Freeman Michaels and Barnet Bain. Thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
And welcome to Cutting Edge Consciousness. Freeman Michaels here.
With Barnet Bain. Good moment, everyone. Good moment, Freeman.
Great moment. Great moment. New sponsor.
New sponsor. So this is the first time that we get to say that this broadcast and podcast series is made possible with support from Hierophant Publishing and Insight Events USA, producers of books and events for body, mind, and spirit.
Well, here's the good news.
Yeah.
I love everything that they do. Like every author that they publish is awesome.
Yes. So, I mean, one or two small names, Neil Donald Walsh, Richard Bach, a couple of newbies.
Yeah, and Miguel Ruiz and others. So, it's great. We love them. Randy Davila.
We're very pleased to have them as new sponsors of the program. So, welcome.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks. It's nice to see you.
Oh, it's good to be back.
Yeah.
I miss this chair.
Well, it's missed you. You could take it with you. Many years ago, I had a therapist. I went to him for a few years, quite some time, and then...
Is this Maury?
Yeah, Maury.
And love that guy.
And then when I stopped, he had this big old chair, this giant chair, and I said, I have enough stories in this chair. These stories fold back not just generations, but many, many generations to the back to the biblical era. And if I'm leaving, the chair is leaving as well. And
He gave you the chair?
He gave me the chair. Well, I don't know if he gave it to me, but it's that Woody Allen story. My grandfather on his deathbed sold me this watch. It was very,
that's right.
It was much the same, but I did have the chair.
That's fantastic.
I did have the chair. So, welcome. There's lots to talk about. Many, many things have gone on since you and I sat across from each other.
Yeah.
Some of them true.
Some of them true.
But as you know...
Well, we all have a story, and if it's true or not true, it's kind of irrelevant. Do you like the story you're telling, or do you not like the story you're telling? If you don't like the story, tell a different story.
What's true in your mind is true.
You know what we can talk about today, and I think our guest is kind of perfect for this.
Yeah.
Is there really such a thing as big T, capital T kind of truths? Or, is it pretty much all made up?
Pretty much.
Well, we don't know yet because we haven't asked him.
You know what? Without further ado, I think this is a good opportunity for you to ask Frank Schaeffer, who is with us today.
So exciting!
It is exciting. So Frank is a best-selling author. He is also a movie director. I'm not going to ask him to speak about that because I notice it's not at the top of his resume. But there are things at the top of his resume. Books like Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God.
Great title.
And Keeping the Faith, New York Times bestseller, Keeping the Faith. He's a grandfather of 5 and a survivor of both polio and an evangelical fundamentalist childhood with two of the leading lights of evangelical Christianity as his parents. We'll get into some of that. As we welcome Frank Schaeffer to Cutting Edge Consciousness.
Welcome to the show, Frank.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So let's dive right in. I think growing up, it is likely that there were these big T truths that you were taught. And my sense is many of them you've spent a lifetime sort of either consciously or unconsciously, consciously in the last decade or so, unwinding. But I guess the bottom line question is, are there any big T, capital T truths for you?
Yeah, I think there are. And, this is not sort of trying to be a smart aleck here, but one of them is that unless you embrace paradox, in other words, the fact that we live surrounded by seemingly contradictory evidence on all sorts of things. I'll just give you one example where biological machines evolved from single-celled creatures. And yet, as art and religion, spirituality, love, all these other things prove, we look at the world through spiritual eyes. Well, go figure. So you can come up with a theory to cover that, some religious theology or philosophy, or you can do what I've done in my book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, and simply say that instead of trying to spend our lives trying to resolve the unresolvable, let's instead embrace paradox as an actual truth. a fact of life.
So
That we are sort of here as people who experience one set of things, and yet often evidence tells us differently. So instead of bashing our head against the wall and trying to prove points all the time philosophically or theologically, or worse yet, hating other people who disagree with us, let's embrace the fact that some of these things are very hard to nail down and that life's an adventure and a journey, and that's really what my new book is about.
Yeah. So we're talking really, it seems to me, the evangelical angle is the dogma of it is about knowing. And what I think you're talking about is the empowered sense of I don't know. It isn't a helpless I don't know. In fact, maybe there is even a deep knowing without knowing things with such certainty.
There's a knowing without certainty.
Well, I think that the title itself indicates a little bit of what I'm trying to drive at. And a lot of folks say, well, how can you be an atheist and believe in God? As if it's sort of very literal, which shows to me that they don't really get titles, which are supposed to be interesting and pull you in, not necessarily to make sense. What was Gone with the Wind all about? I mean, you can just go on and on. But the title does have a point, and that is, when you say you're an atheist who believes in God, what you've really said is, hey, look, I'm against labeling, and I am not going to stick other people with labels of agnostic or Jewish or Christian, or for that matter, gay, straight, male, female, black or white. We are not just black or white, male, female, gay, straight, Jews or Christians or atheists, agnostic, Hindus. We are complex human beings on a journey, and we change our minds, we grow, our definitions of words grow. I've been married to the same woman since I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. Now I'm 62. Well, ask me about my definition of the word love or marriage. Obviously, it's totally different today than it was when I was this kid who got her pregnant while living in a fundamentalist Christian commune. So that was an interesting experience. But we change. And so I think we put religion and truth and philosophy in kind of special categories at our peril, because actually most of life we're open to not just changing our minds but growing and changing definitions, and no one is their label. I've never met a person who is an atheist. In other words, that defines them. They also are in love. They also have doubts and fears. I've never met a Christian who is just a believer. They have doubts and fears. They fall in love. They fall out of love.
Well, we have a tendency, us humans, to thread back to absolutism. We love guarantees. We like to have a sense of absolutes and guarantees. In fact, we would rather be right than comfortable. And it's sort of a developmental thing. What I'm reading between the lines here is that as we develop as in our capacity to love and to grow and to hold paradox, the need to have absolutes and guarantees
and label everything
and have a knowing, the love affair that we have with logic and with reason, it develops, it seasons, and it matures into a deeper, more intimate, I didn't say better, I just said a deeper quality of intimacy with mystery, with the divine, with spirituality, with our spirituality, and we are less bound by the guardrails that keep us on the straight and narrow. That applies across the board, certainly in my life.
And we begin to love contradiction. I mean, we begin to really embrace the places, at least from my perspective. I mean, Frank, my sense of you, from having just done some research and listened to you a bit, is that at this point, you marvel in those oxymorons. You love splashing around in the paradox. You're an atheist that goes to church, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's funny because, I totally feel that way. I call myself a cafeteria Catholic, right? So...
Yeah. Let's cut to the chase in the present tense, and I hate to get hot and heavy here, but think about it for a minute. If everyone had read my book and agreed with it, I'm not saying they should, who had just been involved in these killings in Paris, and therefore had some sense of irony, some humility about their certainties, cartoonists wouldn't be getting shot up, and abortion clinics wouldn't get bombed, and you would not have people who throw their son out of their house when he turns out to be gay because it somehow contradicts their fixed certainties about human sexuality and that God makes everybody a certain way. So if you're gay, you're a sinner and you've chosen this somehow. So I think, it isn't.
And you would have the wisdom at the same time to be aware of where people are operating from at the levels that they're operating from, and you don't kick a hornet's nest simply because it is my God-given right to.
I hear you. I'm just talking about one factor here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. That's it's the paradox.
We're layering in complexity. We like to do that on this show. I mean, that's really the nature of the conversation. Is let's get a lot of complexity in there, get a really thick soup. Because when we, look, answers are cheap. A really compelling question is worth its weight in gold. One that you just spend a lifetime mulling, right? That's the big game. It's answers are easy. That's totally not what we're up to here. Is let's splash around in the murky water.
Right. And I think the murky water is actually, it isn't even a choice. We're all in the murky water. The point is, do we admit it?
Exactly.
That's a great point.
Exactly. But it takes a maturity to be able to admit that. It takes a certain self-knowing.
Right.
You have to have a kind of mastery of the rules, the developmental rules that we are raised in, that bring us up. We brought up in. We know how to drive the car. I know how to not step on somebody else's shoes.
Right.
And then you know yourself enough to go off book, and I mean that in every way that you can take that. I mean,
one of the points I try to make in the book, and I think you'll like this too, is this idea that we change our brains; they're malleable. Our neurological development actually changes with what we do. Like kids listening to classical music when they're young, or new languages actually grows their brains differently. And the fact is, I think that when you look at people who spend a lifetime certain about uncertainty, yet they're certain, they really become certainty addicts. They demand a sort of a life view which tries to put everything in neat categories, and it simply doesn't work. And that's why I think fundamentalism becomes so bitter and angry in the end. And that's the kind of fundamentalism I walked away from when I left the evangelical religious right and struck out a completely different direction, which resulted in this book. And so for me, it's also my own life journey as someone who's had to fight that certainty addiction and try to recreate my own brain along far less harsh certain lines which exclude other people.
Well, we're all looking to break out of those structures of certainty.
Yeah, look, Joe Dispenza, who's been on the show 3 times, was talking about this. He was saying that the anger, that righteousness becomes a neurological response. It's just something that gets malleated. And, I'll go further with this. My wife and I had a conversation the other day, and we were around some folks who we like, but the conversation is a little boring because it's the same sort of who are we, complaining about, or Jazz and I my wife Jasmine and I can only participate to a certain degree, and they're nice enough people. But I said to her, I think they're addicted to that. I think they're addicted to that story and that drama.
Right.
Well, we live inside our stories. They're bubbles. We live inside those stories. They become familiar. We understand how to respond to a very controlled set of stimuli. And anything outside of those stories requires us to entirely reframe our being. And too much at once is inundating. People it precipitates crisis. We melt down. And there's something else that happens when we live inside these stories. We have a passion. And we also have a great sense of belonging.
Right.
And you see that in communities that are beautiful and growing and open-minded. And
the ones that go to war.
And the ones that are psychotic or you see that in ISIS. I mean,
and belonging is half the deal. I mean, when someone, for instance, asks me, you describe yourself as an atheist who believes in God, and yet you'll take your grandchildren to church, I say, well, how do you explain that? As if I can come up with a philosophical one-size-fits-all answer. I say some very obvious things like, hey, that's the way I was raised. I feel comfortable in a religious community. You got a problem with that? I'm not telling you have to do this or that I'm better or saved or you're going to hell because you don't. I'm just saying I'm comfortable with this, like a Michelin 3-star chef who, when you ask him, what do you like to eat, tells you he loves his mom's home cooking. And this is a guy who can cook anything. So let's get away from all this highfalutin, we have big reasons for things. Let's be honest, we wouldn't even have this discussion unless we'd all been born in Western culture in this time and place. I wouldn't be writing a book where I talk about what I think Jesus really was trying to teach as the last third of my book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, if I hadn't been born in this culture. So this idea that we come to these objective truths as if they are neutral and we found them and now we're right, whether we're part of the new atheist movement or evangelical, is just nonsense.
Well, if you were born in Bangalore...
It's circumstances. It's circumstances. It isn't choice most of the time.
If you were born in Bangalore, for instance, we would be having likely a similar conversation, and it would be nested in an entirely different form, but we would be dealing with the same archetypes.
Yeah.
Exactly, and here's the amazing thing. No matter what period of history it was, I'd be telling you what my grandchildren or children or wife or lover or spouse or work meant to me. So there is a human arc that does follow a pattern through history, but it doesn't have to do with our kind of stated labels and certainties, which is why...
I'm certain of one thing, Frank. I'm certain that we need to put the clutch in for 1 second. We're going to step out. We're going to hear from some sponsors of this program. We're going to be right back after these words with Frank Schaeffer.
Welcome back to Cutting Edge Consciousness, thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
We're back. Thanks for sticking with us. Before the break, I was beginning to ponder in a particular direction. It became increasingly interesting to me to pursue the idea of beauty. I think at the root of every human experience, and certainly every desire to connect through a spiritual path, is the quest for intimacy with beauty, with something that is simultaneously, and here is the paradox again, simultaneously provides a sense of serenity and joy at once. It's not one or it's not the other, but there is some... This paradox is resolved by something a space in between. And I am curious what response you may have to that, Frank.
Well, I love the way you say that, a space in between. I mean, isn't that really where we spend our lives? You know, I was giving a talk the other day up at the Colorado Springs Library, and trying to get an example of what I mean, you know, when I speak of these things philosophically. And I said, look, let's just take the definition of the word love as the same sort of thing as the idea of what belief in God or something may be. You know, some mornings love for me means I bring my wife a cup of coffee in bed. And another time it's, you know, something to do with a sexual relationship. A lot of times, however, it's that one of us says we're sorry after a huge fight where somebody slams the door and you hear tires squeal on the driveway and we leave. So love that day is that you hate the person you're with a little less and you say you're sorry and rebuild a relationship. But all those things are love, and yet if you said, what does belief mean, and you tried to nail it down as if it was just one thing, it would be as crazy as an old married guy like me saying love always means the same thing. It's more what you say. It's that in-between moment, and that's, you know, what I talk about in the book when I tell stories about my wife and my grandchildren, my family, is a means to discuss these things rather than trying to make big, heavy philosophical points all the time with footnotes. Just tell a story about your grandchildren. That's where we live.
I love that. And I think what Barnet said earlier about being developmental, I think that's really critical, because I think what we're talking about here is an embracing of ambiguity, an embracing of the complexity versus a mindset where we need to crunch everything down, as Barnet said in the very beginning, to absolutes and guarantees. We want to know, we want to be right. And that's just, it's okay. It's a stage of development. But if we never grow to where either via experience in life we begin to embrace complexity, or because someone who we admire embraces complexity, then I think a really critical part of a fulfilling life is missed, personally.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, you know, well said. And essentially the tragedy of all fundamentalisms, and I include a lot of the new atheist movement that are absolutists and talk about their day of deconversion as if it's a born-again experience. It's really this quest, as I said before, and I talk about in the book, for a kind of a certainty which really turns into an addiction. We start seeing life that way, and this is something that also smashes up relationships when people expect kind of perfection and certainty. You know, she's not the girl I married. Well, I hope not. You know, it's called growth and development. If she stayed the same or he stayed the same or whatever relationship is, you know, how awful that would be. So essentially, when it comes to these philosophical issues, we should expect the same kind of growth, development, change of mind, openness to admitting we're wrong, backtracking, as we do in other things. And when we eliminate that by kind of a fundamentalism of certainty that says, here it is, this is the revealed truth, this is it, here are the 7 things you always must do, or whatever it is, then you're stuck, and your real life doesn't match your theoretical life, and that's where the bitterness, the anger, the fear comes in, that I think leads to the kind of violence we see in this world when fundamentalists lash out because they're terrified, actually, of the real world. It isn't terrified of other points of view. It's terrified of the way things really are.
Well, and they're addicted. They're addicted to a certain way of thinking. And again, I'm throwing it back to Barnet, that space piece, right? That's what we're looking for, space for more of something.
Space is developmental. It requires, you don't give space to a youngster.
Right.
Right.
You give an opportunity for a youngster. You give enough space for the youngster to thrive, to love, to grow. You seed them with a certain base level set of beliefs. Those are always reflections of your own values. But when those beliefs are, when part of when a subtext of the beliefs is don't ever change these.
Right.
If you ever change these, you will no longer belong.
You're out.
You are out. You are no longer belong.
No longer get loved.
You no longer belong to me. Now there's a tyranny involved there.
Yeah.
There's a closed loop, and you have fully grown people who have certain parts of their operating procedure grounded in beliefs that are many, many, many years old. So beliefs are not objective facts. I mean, science tells us there are no such thing anymore as objective facts.
That's where I think the dismantling of the big T truths is actually a kind of wisdom.
Well, and a certain kind of fundamentalism in any area, whether it's religious or philosophical or in any domain of living, it restricts us to a set of hand-me-down beliefs. They're always the beliefs of others that we have embraced as our own, and it separates us from our humanity. And by the way, just as an aside, Frank, many years ago, I don't think many of our audience knows this, that I wrote the Jesus film for Bill Bright.
Wow, you and me have crossed paths somewhere down the road there, man.
I think it's one of the world's, like, you know the statistics, world's most translated or something.
It is the most widely seen film on the planet.
Hey, you wrote the world's most popular movie, and let Hollywood go figure, hey?
Exactly. 20 feet left of the 405 in Los Angeles, nobody knows what that is.
Yeah, well, hey, I do. But, speaking of Bill Bright and these guys, I think, one of the interesting things that's happened to me since Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God has been published is the traffic I'm getting email on Facebook-wise from so many people who write to me something like this. And you were talking about people who are stuck. Hey, I had a conversion experience when I was 20. Now I'm a pastor. I'm 55 years old. I actually agree with what you're saying. If I said it from the pulpit, I'd be fired. I don't know how to earn a paycheck otherwise. So, thanks for writing the book. It's personally liberating, but I could never go there because I'm stuck. And I either hear the word stuck or something like that so often from people who are in the professional religious environment, and they have to hold on to creeds that they bought into at some point and pretend for the rest of their lives that they believe them the same way they did when they were 20. And I just think that's so crazy.
It is crazy. It's also the business element of it, right? So
it is. Oh, the God business. I mean, all kidding aside, I'm 62 years old. I wish I had the income I had when I was 22 and a sidekick to my father in the nepotistic God business. Dad was Francis Schaeffer. We were riding around in Jerry Falwell's private jet. Them were the days. But, the money was the only good part of it, and even that wasn't so great because there was a real lack of integrity there.
Yeah. So this is a really important piece of the puzzle. What's at stake when we begin to develop and grow out of the stuff that holds our world together. Because look, it is disorganizing. And whether we're talking about a marriage that's founded on some agreements that, may be naive when we enter into them, but they're trappings. They're what we get caught up in, or it's a business, or for our world, Barnett and I's world, we often talk about people's platform. Well, their platform hasn't evolved. Well, it can't, because that's their target. They can't.
And their platform is locked in. It's geared to a fundamentalist structure. And just to be fair to evangelicals and fundamentalists and Christians and all the rest of it, I think the same is true for some of the new atheist people. I mean, who knows
Absolutely.
what doubts and philosophical kind of speculation some people like Chris Hitchens, who I had a nice correspondence with, by the way, back in the day when he was reading my memoir, Crazy for God, and so forth. I mean, a lot of these guys are people I admire and like, but nevertheless, they have an audience they have to cater to, too.
They have to be true to their brand. They have to be true to their brand.
They got to sell the brand. And basically, my new book is saying, hey, there is no brand, which is probably one reason bookstores have the trouble of deciding which bookshelf to put it on, because it's like, hey, where does this belong? On the new atheist or the religion bookshelf? And I'm saying neither. It belongs where most people's brains are. And
Interesting.
that is open to ambivalence and paradox. Not everybody belongs on a neat little shelf. And that's the whole anti-labeling thrust of the book.
Yeah, interesting thing about atheists, the new atheism movement. I mean, it reminds me. It's almost literally the same sort of phenomena that happens when youngsters become defiant about their parents. We are raised in an environment, and we either fall into it or we become defiant of it. Both ways, right. It's running us. So there's such a deep relationship with such a deep. All the defiance is not defiant at all, because atheists still have a very intimate. It takes a very intimate relationship with God to dance that close every day, and
right.
and make it make it a beef every day. Now, if you come to a place where you are indifferent.
Some equanimity.
There's some indifference. I mean, if you're not actually running a God conversation or a rebellion every moment of every day, when you come to the place where you're absolutely as indifferent to it as I am, for instance, about the SPCA. Now we're going to get calls, but it's not something that I think about except twice a year.
When you write the check,
then someone it can be argued that someone is living a life where, at least at the level of their conscious awareness, they have an indifference. But an atheist, that is an intimate dance. That's a bad divorce.
It's a bad divorce,
and it no less discounts that transcendent energy that is loving enough to even hold that bad divorce.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's no one kind of atheist, there's no one kind of Christian, obviously. All these terms are just porous, which is part of the whole thing about not wanting to get stuck with labels. But the other point is, of course, that when you look at these categories, they're never as simple. I knew Billy Graham personally back in the day when my dad and he were friends, and Billy used to tell Dad that he feared death. He sometimes didn't believe there was a heaven. Well, he never said that from the pulpit, but maybe if he had, and maybe if atheists talk about their own doubts and fears, and maybe if we all just said, let's pretend we're on a desert island having a couple of drinks here and there's nothing to lose by being honest, none of us would be quite as locked in to what we say, which is why I go back to stories about my grandchildren and family, and where I think we really live our daily lives, which is not these big, quote, big truth ideas, but it's down where humans actually spend most of their time, and that's in human relationships, where we actually I think, come closer to seeing the truth of what life is about than in the big ideas about life. The real question is not what does somebody believe, but how does he look in the eyes of the people who know him best? What does he read there in the eyes of a grandchild or a child or a lover or a wife or a husband? That's where the truth resides. It isn't in ideas about ideas. It's the actual living of life.
That's beautiful. It's the nuance. But here's the thing, and not just the brand piece with the Billy Grahams and those who can't leave their platform, as it were. there's also the hierarchy, right? Because look, one of the addictions is in the addiction to rightness is the power it gives us. So if you got a bunch of people following you because they've projected maybe a God complex onto you, I mean, maybe just, pastor, but I think it goes deeper than that. You gonna give that up, So I mean, this piece of honest. If we're really honest, well, for a lot of people's lives, they can't be,
Right.
And it takes a compassion to hold that and to be aware of that. So,
I often marvel, Barnett, because there's a few folks who their certainty I bump up against, but they're not conflicted, which is why it works for them. But I always think for me, I couldn't do that because my relationship with paradox and this sort of development, I've developed to a point where I can't be so righteous. It just wouldn't fly. And that they can, especially when I kind of see the economics of it, I'm like, wow, that's really working for them. But I can't do that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Right. No, totally. And I think the truth of the matter is that when we try to hold people's feet to the fire for consistency, hey, listen, you said you were a born-again Christian, or you said you were an atheist, or, you said you were in love with this person and now you've walked away. That's great if we were all cast in concrete, but we're not. We grow and we change. And so, when we look at these issues, if we put them in the same category as the rest of life, then obviously, for instance, looking at the teachings of Jesus as reported in the New Testament, every time he confronts the Torah or the law or his Bible, as it were, he's always challenging it. He's saying, well, the law says thus and so, but here's what I'm telling you. So, but is the big word. They say do this, but I tell you this. And then when you look at the actions, the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman who comes to him, and even she knows he shouldn't be talking to her. She says, hey, I'm of the wrong tribe. Our religions don't even agree. He says to her, hey, none of that matters. The day's coming when it doesn't matter where you worship or your theology. God only wants to deal in categories of spirit and truth. So it's interesting to me that Christians who say they believe that Jesus is the Son of God don't actually read their Bible through him as he read his Torah, which was to argue with it, interpret it, pick and choose, and even deny some of it and say, I don't care what it says, here's what I'm telling you. That's the freedom that comes with following Jesus. Oddly, Christians don't take it because instead of worshiping God, they worship a book. They want the law to remain the law.
Brilliant. I love it. All right, so listen, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the segment, and so we're going to have to say goodbye to you. But we love the book, and we want folks to know, Frank, where they can get more, because I think, what you're talking about for a lot of folks, and what I understand from the book is there's a humanity in it and an honesty in it that I think makes it very relatable. So give folks, if you will, a website or some way they can access your material.
Sure. Well, first of all, if they want to communicate with me, just hit contact on frankschaeffer.com. That's FRNKSCHAEFFER.com. I do answer my emails. And then secondly, if they want to get the book, it's on Amazon, both in Kindle and the paperback. And it's also in Barnes & Noble and other bookstores. So please do get the book and write and tell me what you think of it.
It's awesome. Thanks so much. I'm thrilled we had the chance to get you on and stir the pot and...
Yeah, and share our deep roots together. So we appreciate it.
Hey, what a pleasure this has been. And like I say, this was just great to find out that you'd made that movie because, hey, it's a small world. Never slam the door too hard.
Exactly. we thank Frank Schaeffer for being with us today on Cutting Edge Consciousness. We're going to step away for a few words. We'll be back in a moment.
Welcome back to Cutting Edge Consciousness, thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
And welcome back to Cutting Edge Consciousness. Freeman Michaels here with Barnet Bain. Wow, we started up. That was great, Frank.
Yeah, that was a whirlwind.
Frank is fantastic.
There's a whirlwind of energy and activity.
You know what I loved about it?
Yeah.
Is just the language of it's an addiction. That these thought patterns are addictive, and we get so caught up in them that we lose the greater perspective. Part of the work that I know that you and I both ascribe to, whether it's called mindfulness or not, I don't know, but just some way of sort of putting the clutch in on the sort of, the gear, as it were, to use that analogy to stay with it, that we go into, the sort of default gear that we throw into as a response to, something stressful or whatever. The ability to sort of pause and back off and go, whoa, because the fundamentalism is an addiction.
Yeah, and I hope that not too many of our listeners, that we haven't offended too many of our listeners by that.
I don't think so. I think our audience is okay with it, but maybe not. I don't know. We'll get letters. You're going to get letters on the SPCA thing.
There are sets of beliefs and patterns and responses to life that come up in the moment, in real time, and they are significant. They are substantially similar enough in tone that they poke at very old bruises, and most of these bruises are young childhood bruises. Some of them are even pre-verbal bruises, things that happened to our parents, and
pre-lifetime bruises.
Some of that too, depending how far out. And I know we have plenty of listeners who are that far out, and I'm there with them, and so are you.
Yeah.
But whether you believe in those sorts of things or not, or even believe that there is impact on the biochemistry that flooded your system, your mother's biochemistry that was one with your biochemistry in utero, and that whatever stresses or things that she was going through, there is an analog, of chemical analog and neurological analog that is imprinted in you. All the way up through all our early years in conditioning and patterning, and they show up. We make sense of them with beliefs. Some of them we form, some of them are given to us. And then we hang on to these, and we're encouraged to hang on to them. We make entire belief systems.
Yeah.
And we become committed. And just, I'm not going to use the word addicted, because I think I believe you're right, but I also think it connotes all kinds of other things. But we become safe inside them. We don't feel safe outside of them, because when we venture too far outside of them, again, those early patterns get fired up and they can work us.
Yeah. Can I say something about the word addiction? Here's why that word works for me, but here's where it can be challenging. The way it works for me, again, hearkening back to Dr. Joe, is how he describes the wiring and firing in the neurochemistry. Annie Newberg did the same thing when he came on. But what we have with the addiction is we have, many of us, a belief about that. Like, we get very fundamentalist about that. Like an addict needs to go through recovery, versus I have lots of addictions. And can I have a consciousness that's big enough to hold all those addictions without having to get fundamentalist about the addiction, right? So that's the layer.
The question is, can you? And I think that we can.
Right.
Much of our community is focused on scratching, on pulling on layers of that onion.
Yeah.
Most of our community, I'd say all of our community is focused on pulling on layers of that onion. There are depths and there are depths. And, you're talking about Joe Dispenza. He is scratching at much more than these superficial layers of, I'll change my beliefs, or I'll act as if, or I'll rah-rah. He does talk about where this neurology is sourced. And until you can get down, you can make all kinds of change. We can make all sorts of change in our life, and it's practical, and it'll stick to a level. But when you get right down to the core, to the fundamentals of how we are blueprinted, and where we got blueprinted from, much of it, as you say, maybe even some of it pre-life. I happen to believe that, as do you. Much of it early life. This is the architecture out of which the entire house, the structures of our lives are built. And we can repaint them, we can redecorate them, we can even remodel things. But until you get down into the foundation,
big time,
you're going to change the look of it, but you're not going to shift the paradigm.
Yeah. You know where this conversation sort of evolves for me, and I think this is very appropriate, because you talked about what kids can handle and how you give them a worldview that crunches things down into a simpler sort of perspective, right? And that's right. And yet one of the challenges for me as a parent, and I believe this is probably true of you when Sophie was younger, is how to maintain complexity without confusing them too much. Like I always think we're sort of I have a polytheology, right? We take them to a Catholic church, we take them to a temple, we take them to we sort of spread it around, and yet the tradition that my kids are growing up in is Catholic by culture. But the thing too is also just with artistic and creative endeavors that we have a space, quite literally, in our home, which is the art table. And it's existed since they were children. And it still exists. They still spend time regularly at the art table because art for us is really important. And so again, it's this creating space where, more can exist, more than let's say I had as a kid. There's more space for them to have divergent beliefs and complex beliefs. And there's more space for them to creatively explore. That's my kind of, if you want to call it, theory of parenting. It's actually my aspiration of parenting, because a theory would say that I've figured out how to do it, and that's not true. It's a work in progress.
I really love that. I love that so much. I think that kids come away from their parenting experience with a blueprint that they inherit from us that is largely reflective of not what we do and not what we say, but who we're being and what our values are. And so if you take them to like 20 different mosques and churches and synagogues and stuff, I don't get that they're going to be confused. I get that they're going to walk away with a connection to the underlying values.
That's our intention. Absolutely.
So that's a really big piece of it for me. A really huge piece is this awareness of, well, what is the environment that you're bringing? And if at the end of the day, what they're coming away from, that they're taking from you is a sense that they are free to be the same as you,
right,
more than you, or less than you, without any threat of losing your love, that they could be, the idea of winners and losers, and
brutal.
It's brutal, and as conscious as we are as parents or friends or bosses, or we still bring these ideas of these judgments with us. The degree to which we can allow our friends and our children to be different from us and not have to perform up to any sort of our own expectations. Now they are not married. They are not wedded in any fundamentalist way to early beliefs. They're free to change them.
Yeah. Even we've covered this on the show before, the unconditional, like nothing's really completely unconditional. I get it. Unconditional love. It's more theoretical or maybe even an aspiration. I aspire to be, let's call it, less conditional. That my intention is to peel away conditions as best I can.
Yeah, but there are layers of that before you hit the third rail.
Truly.
So you are a very free-thinking, very loving. So if your child decided to go off and join a cult, for instance,
right,
it might trigger some things.
Yeah.
If your child decided to become, if you had one lifestyle and your child chose another one, like a polyamorous lifestyle,
or even their sexuality, whether they're straight or gay,
and these things, they trigger the edges of your of your upbringing. They trigger the edges of how you hold yourself, and very often you may find yourself. I know in my own life, I found myself really surprised to discover the edges that
that's right. Well, the way we relate to our biases. I think Stuart Emery was the one who was on the show talking about that. We bump up against a bias, and instead of pretending like we're not biased, it's like, how do we go, oh yeah, that's one of my biases. And
if you can model a response, if I can model a response, I don't have children in the house, but I do have friends and I do have a spouse and if I can begin to more and more embody a different kind of response to bumping up to my biases, where I am strong enough to be vulnerable, strong enough to lean.
I love that.
Strong enough to say, this is too much for me. I'm having trouble here because I'm up against my biases. But part of my conditioning is that, you know, that whole sort of, you got to be strong and silent. That like was this male conditioning that I grew up in. And you never showed that you're losing it, or you're up against the bias, or you're kerfuffled. You don't show that stuff because it's
got to get through that nonsense. You know, one of the things, I brought up Stuart Emery, there's something else he said that I loved. He was talking about respect and the 3 levels of respect. The first sort of being tolerance, which is a very low level of respect. The second level, I think, was like civility. Good manners is what he called it. And then the third, which we aspire to, is sort of high enough regard for another person where we really long to understand them and to hold their differences in a way that allows them to be different and so forth. And I love that distinction. I've actually found myself, you know, kind of thinking about that a bit since that show. You know, again, tolerance, like, okay, I'll tolerate. You know, that's not a deep level of respect. Civility, good manners, okay, we'll follow the rules, but, you know, there's no depth to it. And then that third, can I really hold people in high regard? Again, in aspiration, because I watch my own judgments, I watch my own biases. And anyhow, I just want to...
We can only transfer that by becoming exponents of it. So I can't transfer that as an idea. You know, as you're directing a movie, for example, you're directing an actor. You cannot ever get an actor. You cannot... encourage an actor to go. You know this very well. You cannot encourage an actor to go someplace that you yourself have not been or are not willing to go.
Yes.
So, like for exactly the same reasons, you cannot inculcate. You cannot develop a capacity in another or in a child to have a deep respect for another human being, unless you yourself exhibit, not talk about, but unless you exhibit that. And we have precious few models for that. Fortunately, we seem to be blessed with more and more of them. You know, I think that our new Pope
I like him.
I like this.
He's a Jesuit.
I like this guy because he doesn't. What he says is. I don't think he takes what he says too seriously.
There's space to go back to this.
He creates the space. His behaviors, his actions, are all the communication that one needs to come away with knowing I don't have to have the same values as you. Yep. You don't have to have the same values as the Holy Father. You don't have to have the same sexuality as the Holy Father, and you will not be dissed.
The fundamentals of the Jesuit theology, contemplatives in action. This is just awesome that you really contemplate. And there's spiritual exercises of Ignatius and this whole way that they really go into contemplation, but then take action. It's not enough to think it. You don't stay in a monastery. You go out and do something in the world. And the structure of it is that there's no hierarchy. And so even a friend of mine is the provincial for right now Oregon, but it'll be Oregon and California, actually the whole western states in a minute here. They're shifting that. And it's only for a brief amount of time. And then he goes back to,
his shoe business.
Well, or yeah, whatever it is.
Running his dress shop.
But the thing is, what is brilliant in the theology that's so distinctly different than traditional Catholicism is that they really believe in dismantling hierarchy. It's not part of their thing. And there's a number of things, but that piece of the puzzle, I think, is really critical. So he really embodies that nothing's better or worse, you know? And of course, the contemplative in action. And being educated by the Jesuits, they would always say, we don't teach you what to think, we teach you how to think, which was a critical distinction. It wasn't like there wasn't a box. There was, but the box when I got to my Jesuit high school and then college was it blew up and there was all kinds of new possibilities. So that's my background, having a sort of intimacy with the Jesuits. That is why I think this Pope is so distinctly different, because it's almost a different theology. Hey, I know we're at the end of the show.
We should have an Enneagram show.
We should have an Enneagram show, and we should get the Pope on.
Yeah, see if you can make that call.
I can get the provincial on, though.
See if you can make that call. I say we should have an Enneagram show because the Enneagram is an amazing topic. It is a sort of a tool and a path that for many years was shepherded by the Jesuits and to this day, among others. And it's a very, very provocative way and compelling way to gain intimacy with our frameworks, with those blueprints that we were talking about earlier. You can begin to see yourself in certain kinds of character styles.
We're going to close, but what's very interesting is Enneagram and lots of other Jesuit theology pieces, the Pierre de Chardin pieces, were always embraced, but in a very marginal way in terms of traditional mainstream Catholicism. Most Catholics know nothing about what you're talking about. So you're actually into the mysticism that lies at the root of the Jesuit tradition, but is not like commercial. It's not known. So very
well.
Cool
it was
stuff.
not. It was not appreciated.
It wasn't.
The Vatican
like
did
that one.
everything
They
they
didn't
could.
like liberation theology either.
They didn't like
that wasn't that
anything.
long ago.
But they
either.
were also a little bit frightened of the Jesuits because they had such a deep spiritual they understood spiritual psychology so deeply because of the Enneagram and others.
Right.
That it looked a little magical and a little scary, and nobody wanted to mess with these
All right,
guys.
we're going to say goodbye. We'll talk about it more. Come back next time.